The sea was a mirror that morning, wide and silver under the hush of dawn, stretching so far that sky and water seemed to bleed into one. Elias stood alone on his weathered fishing boat, the engine silent now, letting the vessel drift gently with the tide. This far out, 50 miles from shore, the world felt abandoned by noise. No birds, no waves breaking, just the rhythmic creak of the hull and the whisper of salt in the air. It was the kind of stillness that made even breath feel intrusive. Elias had been coming out here for years, but not always alone. Once, his wife Clara had sat beside him, her laughter folding into the sea breeze as naturally as the wind filled the sails. She used to pack extra sandwiches, talk to the waves as if they might answer, and remind him that the ocean, though vast and unknowable, had a way of offering clarity when nothing else could. After she passed, the sea became his refuge, not because it healed him, but because it didn't ask anything of him. It simply allowed him to float in silence. This morning had been like so many before it. He had cast his lines with patient hands, brewed a cup of strong black coffee over a tiny flame, and stared across the glittering surface without expectation. The horizon offered no promises, only space. And in that space, Elias found a kind of peace that life on land no longer afforded. Yet beneath that calm, something unfamiliar stirred. He couldn't name it, not yet. Only that today felt different, like the ocean had held its breath along with him. The morning sun had begun its slow climb, spilling gold across the water, and Elias leaned back against the wooden rail of his boat, eyes half closed. The sea was flat as glass, a rare gift in waters this far from land. Time lost its way out here. Minutes slid into each other without notice, and Elias welcomed it. He sipped his cooling coffee and watched his lines, content in the quiet hum of isolation. Then something broke the rhythm. A small ripple disturbed the surface off the port side, subtle at first, like the lazy turn of a submerged log. Elias squinted, setting his cup down slowly. Driftwood wasn't unusual, not even this far out. But this wasn't drifting. It moved with purpose, if weakly. A slow bob, then a pause. A push forward, then sagging stillness. He stepped forward, shielding his eyes with a sun-spotted hand. The shape was dark, bulky, soaked and sagging. He thought maybe it was a seal, but the movement was wrong. It didn't glide. It struggled. He reached for his binoculars, lifting them with growing unease. Through the lenses, the shape resolved into fur, matted, thick, heavy with seawater. A bear. A grizzly. His breath caught. It wasn't possible. Bears didn't belong here. Not 50 miles offshore. It was so exhausted it barely moved, its head dipping below the surface before lurching back up with a gasp. For a moment, Elias froze, the absurdity of the sight locking him in place. Then instinct took over. He dropped the binoculars and scrambled to start the engine, the old motor coughing before catching. The boat lurched forward as he guided it toward the animal. His hands were steady, but inside, his heart raced with disbelief. What was a grizzly doing this far from land? How long had it been swimming? And how much longer could it survive? The questions piled up, but he had no time to chase them. All he could see now was the struggle in the water. A creature built for forests and mountains, slowly losing a fight against an unfamiliar, endless blue. Elias knew desperation when he saw it. He had felt it in his own bones once, and now it floated before him, barely clinging to life. As the boat crept closer, the true size of the animal became undeniable. The bear's head lolled weakly, its snout barely above the water, each breath a desperate rasp. Its limbs moved with a sluggish rhythm, not swimming anymore, just existing. Elias throttled down the engine and reached for the long hook he kept on board, not as a weapon, but as a makeshift tool. His hands trembled slightly, not with fear, but with the weight of what he was about to attempt. The grizzly wasn't threatening, it was dying. He grabbed a coiled rope and threaded it through the tarp he used to protect his nets. His movements were quick but purposeful. Wrapping the rope around his arms, he cast the tarp across the water, letting it drift until it touched the bear's side. There was no reaction, no growl, no panic. The creature was beyond that now. Elias leaned over the edge and secured the tarp gently under the bear's chest. It took several tries. His back ached, shoulders screaming, but he didn't stop. Every tug brought resistance, not from the animal, but from the impossible weight of waterlogged fur and flesh. Elias braced his feet, wrapped the rope around a cleat for leverage, and pulled with a grunt that echoed across the quiet sea. Inch by inch, the bear's body came up, first its forelegs, then its shoulders, the soaked mass slumping like wet sacks of grain. Elias gasped for air, sweat running down his face despite the ocean breeze. Finally, the bear collapsed onto the wooden deck with a dull thud, water pooling around its frame. It didn't move. Its eyes were closed, chest rising only slightly. Elias dropped to his knees beside it, breath ragged, heart thundering. For a moment he simply stared, unsure whether what he'd done had helped or only delayed the inevitable. The grizzly was enormous, yet in this moment, it looked small in a different way. Vulnerable, powerless. Elias placed a hand gently on its side, feeling the weak rise and fall. There was still breath, still life. That was enough. He reached for a dry cloth, dabbing salt water from the bear's eyes. Then he unfolded another tarp and draped it over the creature's back. It wasn't much, but it was warmth. He moved carefully, not out of fear, but respect. This wasn't just an animal. This was something the sea had nearly claimed, and somehow, he had been chosen to pull it back. The sun had risen higher now, casting sharp light across the deck, but the bear didn't stir. It lay curled near the stern, massive and motionless, its soaked fur clinging to its ribs in patches. Elias sat beside it, his knees stiff from exertion, his clothes damp with salt and sweat. He had draped the old brown tarp over its back, tucking the edges gently like a blanket on a restless child. Beneath it, the bear's breath came shallow and slow, but it was steady, and that was all he could ask for. He fetched a small jug of fresh water from his supply and, with cautious hands, soaked a cloth and pressed it lightly to the bear's lips. Some of the water was taken in, barely a sip, but enough to prove the will to live hadn't vanished. Elias gave a soft nod, a quiet thank you to whatever force had guided the creature toward his boat. Then, as the boat rocked gently in the open sea, he sat and began to speak. Not loudly, not like someone expecting answers, just a quiet voice in the wind, like talking to an old friend. He told the bear about Clara, how she used to rescue stray cats in their neighborhood, how their small house had always been full of creatures in need. She had a way with them, with all living things. He hadn't thought about those years in a long time, not since she passed and took the light from the corners of his world. Her voice had faded from his dreams. Her touch, once so vivid in memory, had slipped through the cracks of time. But something about this moment, the weight of the bear, the frailty hidden in its strength, the way it had trusted him without a fight, brought all of it back. He remembered the winter they found a hawk, half-starved and with a broken wing, and how Clara had refused to let nature take its course. They built a wooden box, nursed it daily, and watched it fly again weeks later. She'd cried when it left, not because it was gone, but because it had survived, and she believed survival was sacred. Now, Elias felt something stir in his chest that he hadn't let himself feel in years. The ache of caring, the risk of hope. He reached out again, brushing matted fur from the bear's brow, wiping salt from its closed eyes. The creature didn't flinch, didn't growl, just breathed. He offered more water, lit the small burner to make himself tea, and kept talking about the sea, about the quiet, about the way loss feels heavier when you stop pretending it isn't there. And as the hours passed, the silence between them began to change. It wasn't the emptiness he was used to. It felt filled, shared. The ocean stretched endlessly around them, but Elias no longer felt adrift. For the first time in a long time, the weight in his chest wasn't grief. It was responsibility. A life had been placed in his care, and in caring for it, something inside him had begun to breathe again too. The engine had long gone quiet, and the boat now drifted with the rhythm of the tide. There was no need to steer. Elias had no destination in mind. The world around him was an endless canvas of blue, and he let the current decide where they went next. The bear still slept, or perhaps hovered somewhere between waking and unconsciousness. Its chest rose with more certainty now, but it hadn't opened its eyes. Still, Its presence changed everything. Elias sat on a crate near the bow, watching the ripples stretch outward like rings from some forgotten impact. The sun had climbed higher, softening the sharp edges of morning into a warm embrace. A gull flew overhead, the first sign of life in hours, and for a moment Elias imagined it was checking in on them, sent by the sea to keep watch. He looked back at the bear, its size unmistakable even in stillness. How had it come to be here? Had it fallen into a river and been swept out? Had some distant landmass lured it too close to the edge of safety? He imagined towering forests and glacier-fed streams, valleys where the animal had once roamed freely. Had it been hungry? Chased? Lost? He would never know, and maybe that was the point. Not everything needed answers. Some stories were written in silence, carried by waves and wind, felt rather than told. And yet, the mystery didn't trouble him. In fact, it brought comfort. For the first time in years, Elias didn't feel like the only living thing adrift. This creature, born for solid ground, now shared the same vast loneliness he had come to accept as his own. But where the bear had fought and nearly drowned, Elias had simply floated through the years, detached and half alive. Now they drifted together, two beings thrown off course, bound by a fragile thread of chance. He found himself watching over the bear not just with concern, but with something gentler, something deeper. There was trust forming between them, not spoken, not forced, just present, like the tide beneath them. The ocean no longer felt empty. It felt sacred. As the day wore on, Elias refilled the cloth, offering water again, brushing flies away from the bear's muzzle. He worked in silence, but his mind was filled with quiet thoughts, old memories, and an unfamiliar sense of connection. He had saved a life, maybe, but something told him that this life had saved something in him, too. He didn't know what would happen next, whether the bear would live, or rise and flee, or simply fade. But for now, in the drifting silence of a sunlit sea, he wasn't alone anymore. It began with a twitch, a slight flicker of the paw, so small it could have been mistaken for the breeze. Elias noticed immediately. He had been sitting nearby, resting his back against the side of the boat, eyes on the horizon, but his attention always drifting back to the bear. When the paw moved again, followed by a soft groan from deep within the creature's chest, he straightened. The bear stirred, sluggish and confused. Its body, so heavy with fatigue, struggled to obey its own instincts. One leg shifted beneath it. Another tried to push against the deck. For a moment, it managed to lift its head, blinking against the harsh light, nostrils flaring as if testing the air. But the effort was too much. With a low grunt, the bear collapsed again, its body thudding back into stillness, not unconscious this time, just too weak to continue. Elias didn't move closer, didn't speak. He only watched, breathing slowly, keeping his presence calm. He knew wild things didn't respond to panic. They responded to energy, to intention, and he didn't want to give the bear any reason to fear him. He sat quietly, arms draped over his knees, letting the space between them stay open and honest. The bear's eyes opened again, just slightly this time. It turned its head, groaning softly, and its gaze settled on him. Not sharp, not threatening, just there, as if trying to make sense of the figure beside it. For a long breath, they looked at each other. Not a stare, not a contest, just two creatures measuring the moment. Then the bear's eyes closed once more, its breathing steadier now. Elias let the silence return, though something had changed. There was no fear in the boat, no tension, just the quiet hum of shared existence. He didn't know what the bear saw when it looked at him, but he knew what he felt in return. Not dominance, not pity, just recognition. They were survivors, both of them, drifting, wounded, still breathing. And for now, that was enough. By midday, the bear had begun to shift with more purpose. It raised its head and held it for longer stretches, nostrils flaring, chest rising with more steadiness. Elias watched with quiet awe as the creature, still heavy with fatigue, began to reclaim pieces of itself. There was strength returning to its limbs, the beginnings of awareness in its eyes. Elias took this as a sign. Gently, he stood and moved toward the helm. He started the motor, careful not to jar the piece they had built. The engine groaned to life, a low rumble cutting through the stillness, and the boat began to turn. The compass offered the direction home, but it was memory that guided him now. He hadn't thought about the shoreline all morning. For a while, it had seemed like the sea would hold them forever. But now it was time to return. As the boat moved forward, the bear shifted again. Not in fear, not to flee. It simply lifted its head and looked at Elias. The gaze was longer this time, steadier, holding something that stirred a knot in his throat. There was no threat in those eyes, no wild confusion, just a strange calm, a kind of knowing. Elias didn't speak. He couldn't. Words would have broken the spell. He only nodded once, quietly, like acknowledging an old truth, finally remembered. The hours passed slowly. The coastline was still a far blur on the horizon, but the boat was moving now with direction and meaning, and inside it, two lives had found each other in a place neither belonged. From time to time, Elias glanced back. The bear didn't sleep anymore. It rested but stayed awake, occasionally lifting its head to take in the sea around them. Once their eyes met again, and in that single moment, Elias felt something that went beyond explanation. Not gratitude, not recognition in the human sense, but something deeper. A silent bond that came not from language, but from having survived the impossible side by side. He turned back to the wheel and steered toward land. Behind him, the bear watched, not as a beast watching a man, but as one soul watching another, both finally on their way home. The shoreline came into view as the sun began its descent, casting long shadows across the waves. Trees rose in the distance like silent guardians, their outlines sharp against the golden sky. Elias felt the boat slow as it neared the shallows, the motor coughing gently before he cut it off. The vessel drifted the final few yards, the soft scrape of the hull brushing sand and pebbles, a sound he hadn't realized he missed. He turned toward the bear. It was awake now, sitting upright, its limbs steadier, gaze alert. Elias didn't move toward it. He simply stood and waited, letting the moment unfold without force. The bear sniffed the air, then slowly, heavily, pushed itself to its feet. Water dripped from its thick coat, each step forward heavy but certain. It climbed over the edge of the boat, landing with a low grunt in the wet sand below. Elias stepped off behind it, boots sinking slightly into the damp earth. He watched as the bear paused, took a long breath of forest air, and began to walk slowly, but without hesitation, toward the trees. With each step, it reclaimed the wildness that the sea had almost stolen. It didn't run. It didn't look back at first, just moved with the calm power of something that belonged to the earth again. But as it reached the edge of the treeline, where the shadows of pine and fir waited like old friends, the bear paused. It turned its massive head and looked over its shoulder, directly at Elias. That gaze held him still. There was nothing dramatic in the moment. No roar, no display. Just that quiet, lingering glance that said more than words ever could. A recognition, a farewell, and something else, something almost like gratitude. Then the bear turned and disappeared into the forest, its form swallowed by the trees and the fading light. Elias stood alone once again, the wind brushing past him, gentle and cool. But the emptiness he'd carried for so long no longer felt so heavy. The sea had given him something he hadn't known he still needed. A reason to care, a chance to feel useful, even seen. He didn't say goodbye aloud. He just closed his eyes for a moment and smiled softly, as if some part of Clara had been there too, watching it all unfold. The story traveled faster than Elias ever could have imagined. A ranger who spotted the bear near the treeline later that evening noticed it had traces of tarp and seawater still clinging to its coat. Word spread, and soon the local paper ran a piece. Fisherman rescues Grizzly 50 miles from shore. Reporters reached out. Wildlife officials wanted details. But Elias gave no interviews. He didn't need headlines. What had happened on that boat wasn't for spectacle. It was something quieter, something sacred. A few days later, he returned to the sea. The same boat, the same horizon, the same silence. And yet, nothing felt quite the same. He glanced toward the spot where the bear had once lain, where damp wood still held faint claw marks and memories. It was empty now, but Elias no longer was. He sipped his coffee, gazing across the calm water, and let the weight of that moment settle in his bones. He had pulled a creature from the edge of death, yes. But somewhere in the effort, in the waiting, in the quiet company, something inside him had also been pulled back to life. He didn't need words to explain it. The sea already knew. If this story moved you, we invite you to be part of more stories that remind us of the quiet power of compassion. Subscribe to the channel for more powerful true stories from the heart of nature and the soul of humanity. Turn on notifications so you don't miss the next journey that might just change a life, maybe even yours. Thank you for watching, and stay connected for more.